think we are ready to get started. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the second webinar in our Addressing Philadelphia's Gun Violence Epidemic virtual convening series. My name is Mark Halk, and I am the Grants and Impact Analyst at the Stoneleigh Foundation. I will be the technician for today's event. Before we begin, please know that we will be setting aside some time at the end of today's discussion for audience questions. If you have a question for any of our speakers, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window on a computer or at the top right of an iPad or phone screen and type your question into the box that appears at any time. Please include your name and organization with your question so that we can identify you for the speakers today. Now, I'd like to introduce the moderator for today's event, founder of Philadelphia Center for Gun Violence Reporting, Jim MacMillan.
Thank you, Mark, and good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Stoneleigh Foundation, I'd like to welcome you to part 2 of our virtual convening series on addressing Philadelphia's gun violence epidemic. My name, as you just heard, is Jim MacMillan. I'm the director of the Philadelphia Center for Gun Violence Reporting, and I will be moderating today's session. For many years, I was a photojournalist who covered a great deal of gun violence here in Philadelphia, and now I strive to advance and support many of the ideas I think you'll be hearing about today. But before I turn to our panelists, I'd like to provide some background for today's event. During the past decade, rates of firearm death and injury have increased dramatically across the United States, even as violent crime overall has continued to decline. And Philadelphia is no exception. As of yesterday, 2,183 people have been wounded or killed by firearm violence in Philadelphia during this year alone. Beyond the physical and mental consequences for individual victims and survivors, we know that firearm violence has a significant impact on the surrounding communities that bear witness to these incidents. The root causes of this epidemic are complex, but research indicates that gun violence is tied to poverty and to place-based historic and structural racism. Unfortunately, these root causes are not often discussed or contextualized in news reporting. Sometimes media reports even bolster structural inequities by reinforcing existing biases and by dehumanizing both gun violence perpetrators and victims. That's why we launched the Philadelphia Center for Gun Violence Reporting in 2020, to explore the hypothesis that changing the practice of news reporting to be more empathetic, ethical, and impactful can reduce trauma and prevent gun violence in our communities. Which brings us to today's event. I'm thrilled to be joined by three key figures in our center's work for a discussion about changing the narrative on gun violence reporting and the role of the news media in reducing trauma, educating the public, and elevating solutions. I will introduce our speakers briefly here, and you will hear more about their work over the course of our discussion. A warm welcome to Dr. Jessica Beard, who is a Stoneleigh Fellow and Director of Research here at the Philadelphia Center for Gun Violence Reporting. Dr. Beard is also a trauma surgeon who cares for firearm injured patients and a widely published public health researcher at Temple University. Oronde McClain is a community activist and the Credible Messenger Newsroom Liaison here at the center. Oronde is also a gun violence survivor and also previously produced a short documentary for our Credible Messenger reporting project. Cheryl Thompson-Morton is the Black Media Initiative Director for the Center for Community Media at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism. Previously, Cheryl was Program Director for the Lenfest Institute for Journalism here in Philadelphia, and she was a keynote speaker at our recent Better Gun Violence Reporting workshop. Welcome to all of you. As a reminder to our audience, following this afternoon's discussion, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A, so please submit your questions throughout the event using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. To kick things off, we'd like to know what you think, what you and the audience think. So please click to answer these two questions when they appear on your screen. Well, first of all, we strive to honor the best gun violence reporting, but that's not always what we find. Do you find most local news reporting on gun violence to be more helpful, more harmful, or maybe you're not sure, or maybe it's too complicated to say yes or no? And then carry on to the second question. Do you think that news reporting can actually help prevent gun violence? Can it possibly worsen gun violence? Does neither of those things seem possible, or perhaps both? We're going to have I guess we'll wait a minute till we have the results, and you'll be able to read them for yourself. And we don't have any final answers now, but these are a couple of the key questions that we are exploring at the center and which just might come up today. So I think we're going to have results in a moment. And here we are. And I'm interested in these results. And as you can see for yourself, most of the votes, and it's a self-selecting audience, of course, but most of the votes among our attendees show that the people think reporting can be more harmful. It's interesting that we don't have any votes that it could be more helpful, but time will tell. We'll talk about that more today. And but for now, I appreciate your responses. The second question, again, you can see for yourself. Wow, what an idea that gun violence reporting can actually it's interesting. Let's say neither or both as possibilities, but mostly both help and do harm or help prevent or worsen gun violence. This is a lot to ingest all at once, but we've got an hour or so to talk about it, or an hour and a half to talk about it. So I'm going to carry on for now, but this is good information to begin with. Thank you. I got a little bit distracted. So here, okay, next. I'd like to open our panel with a question for Cheryl. So forgive my distraction, I'm back. Can you give us a sense of how we got here in terms of how we report on community-based gun violence, and what's the central issue at hand?
Sure. And this is a question that gets really deep. So there's a lot to cover, but I'm going to try to just give broad strokes. And then if we want to dive deeper, we can. So just to give you all a little background on me, I actually grew up in South Jersey in a town called Willingboro, which gave me a pretty standard upbringing. But regardless of that, as I grew up and went to larger regional spaces, people often would act shocked when they would hear that I grew up in Willingboro, because really all they knew about my town was about the crime that happened there, about the town being the first in the county to have metal detectors in the high school. They really didn't understand anything about the culture of the place and the place that I lived and grew up. Now, for context, Willingboro is a Levittown that at this point is about 83% people of color. And as many of you probably know, there's a Levittown right across the river here in Pennsylvania as well. So when I looked at news stories about Willingboro, I saw plenty of stories about crime. In fact, when I did my little research, nearly 50% of the stories on the first 2 pages of Google News feature stories about crime. And when I went to 6ABC and Fox 29 and looked up Willingboro, all of the stories were about crime. By comparison, when I looked at stories about Levittown, the comparison really showed that only 20% of the stories were about crime on an apples to apples basis. Ironically, though, Levittown's crime rate is double the crime rate of Willingboro. And so it was interesting to see that media was not reflecting this reality at all. It actually was distorting the reality. And one of the ways that this translates into communities is really in housing value. I mean, there are so many ways, but we know, as Jim noted, that poverty is linked to increased crime. And when we look at the housing values of Levittown versus Willingboro, which were built around the same time by the same builders, we see that Willingboro housing values are $62,000 less than Levittown homes, which really in many ways makes no sense. But it's one way that we see how the media's coverage of our communities leads to further disinvestment, which could lead to higher crime. And so we see this impact of the coverage that we have of the media's coverage of crime impacting the community overall on what we think, what we often think, and we often see that people are afraid of random people attacking them or being a victim of violent crime, which is not very likely to happen for most of us. We know that the way that the media covered crime in the 90s and even in this recent election leads to increased policy that is harsh on communities of color and impoverished communities. And we also know that the coverage currently does not serve victims well. Oftentimes victims speak about being assaulted 3 times, the first time by the perpetrator, the second time by the criminal justice system, and the third time by the media system who's coming to get a clip, as opposed to really investing in the story. And we have to remember that oftentimes these folks have never interacted with the media before, and media does not do a good job of being trauma informed. So in terms of why we're being covered in this way, it's a very recent phenomenon that we are now at as to why the media covers crime in this way. The Inquirer actually did an excellent deep dive on the history of the modern local newscast, which got its start here in Philly, ironically. And they said that network executives had figured out how to extract news that entertained and attract viewers, which were suburban viewers that attracted advertisers, right? And they attracted them with a familiar storyline, an endless loop of scenes with dangerous urban streets. Crime became a large part of the newscast of the city because crime was cheap to cover. It was easy to cover. You could shoot the scene, you could shoot the blood, you shoot the victims, whatever they got, and you can do it in 20 seconds. And most of the time, the cameramen were documenting crime in certain neighborhoods where poverty and decades of failed social policies had given way to high crime and population loss. That format, which is kind of the eyewitness news or action news, as you all may be familiar with, doesn't encourage reporters often to go back to the scene of the crime, follow up on those root causes, or document the good and complex neighborhoods. But it proves to be a profitable model, right? People like the format, it's cheap to produce. And in Philadelphia, when 6 ABC went to the Action News format, in a year, they shot from the bottom of the rankings to the top, and they still are the most popular newsroom or the most popular TV channel in Philadelphia. And there are also other barriers that come with newsrooms trying to cover the stories from a more systemic frame and away from the kind of episodic coming in, covering the crime and leaving. One, data on crime is not very thorough. It's usually lagging 18 months behind what is currently happening. So it's hard to contextualize one crime within the larger crime data context. Law enforcement can be hostile to the press if we're not compliant. And also, law enforcement has a chief information officer whose job is to get information to journalists who often are trying to get out a lot of stories and not a lot of time. And so it's much easier to use those press releases than to actually, go and talk to community members. There's no chief information officer for Kensington, for example. So it's much easier to get the stories from the police than from the community. And so these all kind of set the groundwork for how we've gotten to where we are. But it also speaks to the challenges. So that is kind of the framework at a very high level, but happy to dive in more and answer any questions there as well.
Well, thank you very much, Cheryl. Yes, we could dive in at length at many facets of that introduction. I really appreciate it. I have questions for the other panelists, but before we move along, I'm wondering if Jessica or Oronde, if you'd like to respond to Cheryl's introduction.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica Beard. Thanks so much for that great overview, Cheryl. You're just so incredible at describing the situation and how we got here. And I just wanted to add that there's quite a bit of research, communications research, that really upholds all of the things that you've said. And specifically, we know that episodic crime reports or reports about shootings that are focused on single shooting events and whose narrator is the police can actually cause a lot of harm. We know that when audiences view those reports, that they tend to blame victims. The alternative to an episodic crime report is a thematic report. That's a story that would tell a broader kind of narrative about gun violence, might include some framing that includes a public health approach, different narrators besides law enforcement, and really provides context that's oftentimes missing from those episodic crime reports. And when audiences view those, they tend to really hold our societal structures and our politicians and other lawmakers accountable for social problems like firearm violence specifically. So, you know, while that's known, you know, sort of less is known about, number one, what the current sort of news content looks like in Philadelphia. That's never been researched. So we're working on that, trying to understand that. And then really, what does the most effective alternative to the episodic crime report look like in real life? So we're trying to get to the bottom of that as well. But I just really wanted to echo, you know, all of what Cheryl said, and just to add that kind of the academic side.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Beard. And so turning to Oronde now, well, of course, I didn't mean to cut it off if you want to respond to, you know, what you've heard so far, and then moving onward from there, you know, from your personal and professional perspective, we're hoping you can talk about why gun violence reporting matters. You know, what is the impact of the reporting from your perspective, and then finally, I'm wondering, how do you see your work as a credible messenger liaison working for the center, making a difference in the way that we tell the stories of gun violence survivors?
How you doing, everybody? And thanks, Jim, for asking that question. That was a great question. So I can back up a little bit. I am a gun violence survivor. I got shot in the back of the head at the age of 10. In Philadelphia, we have a couple good neighborhoods. So my neighborhood was a good neighborhood, like Mount Airy. And the news really, it kind of like backfired, because they was like, it's a 10-year-old that got shot in Mount Airy, and nobody never got shot in Mount Airy. That was like a rare thing. So they always assumed that I was a drug dealer and I was into the streets, but I was 10 years old. And actually, I just moved to Mount Airy maybe 2-3 months ago. So how can I get in all this gang activity? And I was only 10. When I was in the hospital, great hospital, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, the news snuck into my room and tried to get information. I just woke up and it was a big shine of light, but it was cameras and everything. It was like the news tried to get the greatest story, but they don't understand how it hurts the person. So it matters to me deeply, because I'm a victim and a survivor. And on the professional side, when I joined PCGVR, it's like I felt like I had a purpose in life as a survivor to look at all other survivors. Like you said, Jim, we have over 2,100 survivors in Philadelphia just this year. And that is not something that we should brag about, but the news brag about it all the time. It's like, they don't care about, they don't never say, if you turn the news on today, they would never say we have 2,100 survivors. They say we have over 470 murders. That's all they talk about. They don't talk about no survivors at all. And that's pretty harsh to me. With my work with PCGVR, like I said, I felt like that was a purpose. I had to help and uplift other survivors. Going through the process, it helped me as well. When I was doing this documentary, I felt so angry. I was like, listen, we need to exploit the world, exploit the city of Philadelphia, because nobody's helping survivors at all. The media is shattering survivors as we speak, and nobody really paying attention to that. The news and the media is so harmful. For example, you have blood, you have blood all over the cameras. That's all they use. The white sheets, they make that so big. The bullet shells, they target the corners of the bad neighborhoods, and they pull the cameras up and keep showing the street. That's like really dangerous in Philadelphia because you can retaliate. It's like we are living in the media world, but it's not it's harmful for us. And I don't like it at all. That's why I feel like it's so important for me to be a newsroom liaison with this company to try to help the newsroom out. So, for example, I have strong ties with the Inquirer, and we talk about it, and they actually break down and say, you know what, you're right. And it's no other feeling when somebody say, you know what, we're gonna sit down and listen to you. And don't get me wrong, I don't have no education in the media. This is a learning experience for me as well. But we working together. So you have a survivor, a victim, a journalist, and a reporter working together to try to stop the harmful news in Philadelphia. It's a wonderful thing. I thank PCG for like every day for giving me this opportunity because I feel like I'm helping my city out, and it's just me doing this for myself, and I can't help the whole world, but one newsroom at a time. I think we can flip it. We can flip it. Maybe it's going to take some time, but everybody says the newsroom is harmful, but you have a newsroom liaison like Oronde, an activist and a survivor, going into it and infiltrating the newsrooms. And the survivors, I talk to them every day, and they like, listen, I want to do the same thing. Now they opening the doors. Now they're listening. Now they're coming outside because all the news are doing is giving more people PTSD. It's not letting nobody come outside. Nobody want to watch the news because they scared to come outside. It used to be back in the day, we turn the news on to see what kind of, do I need to wear a jacket or not to go outside? But when you turn the news on today, it's like how many shootings, how many people that died. That is so like, how can I call it? It is so sad. Sad is not even the word. It's giving more people PTSD, and they not even having an episode. They're just watching TV and getting PTSD. Imagine they in a trauma situation and they get more PTSD. That's really bad. So I'm here to try to make it better. I think I'm doing a good job, and I feel like I'm giving my city a purpose and the survivors.
Thank you, Oronde. Your thoughts always your words just take my breath away. I'm so grateful to everyone on this call, to all of our staff, past and present at the center, all of our partners, including the Stoneleigh Foundation, but the trust and truth that you and other people with firsthand, extensive lived experience, as we put it, have is just priceless, and I can't thank you enough. Okay, so Dr. Beard, resetting the tone here a little bit. Drawing upon your work as a Stoneleigh Fellow and as a researcher, and building off of Cheryl and Oronde's comments, could you please talk about what's happening in the field now? I know you've got a lot of ground to cover. What's the latest? What else do we need to know?
Thank you so much, Jim. And I want to express gratitude to the Stoneleigh Foundation for supporting us and to have this conversation and to do this work. And as I mentioned before, thank you, Cheryl, for just being an incredible voice in this discussion, and to Oronde for sharing your viewpoint and your experience. And for really highlighting the harms that you see that are happening with our TV news and other platforms. So I am a trauma surgeon. Certainly I'm not as much of an expert on gun violence as Oronde, but for me, it's also personal. And that's why I do this work. And I actually got interested in how the media tells the stories of gun violence when I went to the news to try to understand why there were so many shootings in this city. And I really didn't find much explanation about root causes or solutions. I just saw those episodic crime reports. And I thought, wow, if this is the public's understanding of gun violence, they're getting it all wrong for many, many reasons. Most importantly, the human stories are missing. It's horrendous how dehumanized the victims of gun violence and the communities most impacted are on in episodic crime reports. And that's really at the center of my work, is trying to make that better and trying to minimize the harm of those reports. So with the support of the Stoneleigh Foundation, I became the director of research at the Philadelphia Center for Gun Violence Reporting. And I just want to talk a little bit, since the question was about what's happening, about the work at the center. And I want to say also that I'm very hopeful. I'm hopeful at this time that we can make a difference, that people are listening. And as Cheryl mentioned, media reporting has not always been this way. This is something new. This is something that sort of became popularized from the 60s, but really in the 80s and 90s. And we can share that Inquirer article that Cheryl mentioned. And it's something that we can change. And it's actually something that the journalists in our city and journalists across the country are interested in doing better. And they're listening. They're listening to you, Oronde. So just a little bit about our work. So you heard a little bit about the Credible Messengers Reporting Project. That is a project that brings together people with expertise, with lived experience in gun violence, who want and are ready to tell their stories from their perspective, with journalists who have some more professional experience to create media products. And I have personal experience with that program through one of my patients and his mother. We made a documentary together about healing from gun violence that's available on our website if you'd like to listen. But it's very powerful, and just the centering of my patient's mother to Sean in that narrative was incredible. We also have resources for professional education for journalists. We had a summit back in 2019 that brought together journalists from all over the country to discuss what better gun violence reporting might look like. And out of that came up with some preliminary best practices that we're still honing and now searching and creating evidence to support those guidelines. And we also do research, as I mentioned. So we have a portfolio that's ever broadening of research projects. We're interested in what the content of local TV news reports look like. So we have 7,000 clips of local TV news reports on gun violence that we're analyzing. We're interested in what firearm injured people like Oronde, but specifically recently firearm injured people, feel about reporting on their own injuries. And to that end, we did what's called a qualitative interview study with 26 firearm injured people at Temple, asking them about their experience with news media reporting on gun violence. And they told us all the same things that Oronde told us, that frankly, it's causing trauma, that it's causing increased trauma in the aftermath of injury. It's harming reputation, especially when there's not exculpatory language included. It's making people fearful in general. And one participant told us that he thought that resulted in people arming themselves since the onset of COVID, which we saw happening. And it's making people feel dehumanized. It's making people feel like their lives don't matter and that their injuries don't matter. And these are the people who, have their stories told through episodic crime reports. About half of people don't make the news, we know from our research. And when we asked people how that felt, they actually felt relieved. They felt, honestly, that they didn't expect to make the news, and they were glad that they didn't make the news in a way that could make them look bad and make their communities look bad and make them unsafe. We also heard about threats to personal safety. Like Oronde mentioned, there certainly is theory, but this is not proven, that certain styles of reporting can result in retaliation. And certain elements like mentioning which hospital a survivor goes to could threaten their safety. So those are all the things that we learned from our patients. And that inspired us to hold a workshop for survivors and their family members for our local journalists. And we also had some academic presence there. That was called the Better Gun Violence Reporting Workshop back in September. And out of that, we actually designed and prototyped some solutions with a design lab. And I'd be happy to share those with you. But the short story of those is that participants suggested that we really need to work on building relationships between community and journalists, and on training journalists in trauma-informed principles.
Terrific, thank you. So yeah, in a nutshell, we've got a lot going on at the center. So thank you, Dr. Beard. You know, I realized I didn't, before I go on to the next question, I didn't give anybody else the opportunity to respond to Oronde, or also if Oronde or Cheryl, if you'd like to follow up on anything Jessica just said, I'd like to make hold a little room here before we go on to the next question.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on something Oronde said about, and Jessica alluded to this too, about how communities feel as a result of reporting. And there is a lot of research to show that communities feel less safe than they actually are because of the way that we cover crime generally. In Australia, there have been studies. I mean, throughout the Western world, generally, there have been studies about this. And so, you know, the 90s are a great example because, you know, in the early 90s, we know all of the super predator content was coming out, fear of kind of young Black and brown men specifically, and a lot of coverage about that, which led to policy that harmed communities. But when crime started to decrease in the latter half of the 90s, media coverage of crime didn't decrease, it increased, especially coverage about murder. It increased by 700%, including in Philadelphia. And so when you talk to people, or when people do polling about, do you think crime is increasing or decreasing, in that period of time, pretty much every year, people said crime was increasing, even though in that period, crime was decreasing. And we saw a very similar thing happen very recently with this current election, of where everyone was covering crime. And, you know, crime has increased in this period, but we've seen post-election crime coverage has gone down, actually, because in some ways it was being used as political propaganda for different parties to jockey, as opposed to really focusing on the issues of importance to the people who are most impacted, right? And that's, I think, another key problem with the way that media is being, is covering these issues, because of the original format of kind of serving the suburbanites. It's kind of an infotainment approach as opposed to truly being an approach to help people who are most vulnerable meet their public safety needs.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Yeah,
go ahead.
This piggyback what Cheryl said. Like when I go to the communities, they say, "Well, we don't want to talk to you. No, we don't want our names and our stories to be exploited." And I say, "Listen, hey, I'm Oronde McClain. I'm the Newsroom Liaison for my company, and this is my background." And when they hear my background, they feel so relieved and say, "You know what? Can you represent me?" I say, "Hey, I mean, I can't represent you, but I could get your story heard. I could get your story out there." And that's what the communities want. They don't want the reporters just going in and they don't even bond with the communities. They just go up there and just start shining a light on people's doors. You know, in Philadelphia, that's kind of dangerous now. Now, when I had a meeting with a newsroom maybe a week ago, the reporters was crying because they said they don't really know what to do. And actually, they're traumatized also, and they don't know what to do. They don't know how to approach survivors or victims. They're lost too. So now I'm like stuck in the middle. I'm like, well, I'm a survivor, but I can't really act like a survivor. I am the Newsroom Liaison, so I'm gonna try to help you guys too. So now I'm in the middle trying to help the communities and the newsrooms, because at the end of the day, we're all humans and we got to help each other. But the newsrooms have to try to be a little more open. But as we speak, they are being a little open. Like I have conversations all the time, and I say, "Oh, hey, this a newsroom? Like we're friends now." And they feel comfortable. They feel comfortable going to the communities. They feel comfortable talking to survivors, because all survivors want. I'm just speaking of my experience. Hey, how you doing today? Just, I hate when people label me, oh, that's Oronde, the guy that got shot in the head. If you come to me and say, hey, Oronde, how you feeling today? How you doing today? Or how was school? How was work? Don't just ask me about my past. You don't know how that's going to traumatize me, or is this going to have an onset on my PTSD? And reporters don't realize that. But we get in there. That's what I'd say.
I'd like to just say something, related to that as well. Thank you so much for pointing that out, Oronde. And I think what you and Cheryl both pointed out is that people want to tell their stories. So a lot of times what we hear from journalists is, oh, well, I went to the scene and no one would talk to me. And that's why I've chosen to present the police's information. But what we hear from you, Oronde, is that people want to talk, but the time and place is probably not at the scene of the crime, right? Or the scene of the shooting. The time is, as the person's recovering, or maybe, to tell a story about their life, when the person's mom or someone who knows them better is ready to tell that story. So really follow-up stories are very important. And the whole kind of structure of newsmaking has to change to be trauma informed. And what you're talking about too is having some skills in not re-traumatizing the people that you're interviewing. And so those are all things that we've really identified through conversations, and through our work as necessary next steps. And the other thing that I just wanted to echo back on what Cheryl was saying about sort of crime increasing or crime decreasing and reporting on crime increasing. Gun violence it actually doesn't always kind of follow with crime trends. And so, we are really at a time with gun violence in our city that is an emergency. And so it's a really tricky discussion. More reporting would reflect the epidemiologic change, or the change in numbers and the change in the rate of gun violence. But is it helpful reporting? Is it reporting that is going to just reaffirm things and that don't work, right? Or is it reporting that is going to help people really understand what's causing it and help people understand what effective solutions are? And one can imagine that episodic crime reporting, that is not going to help people understand how to solve gun violence. It's going to make people feel more hopeful and more unsafe. And so we have a model for public health reporting in something called solutions journalism, which is basically a type of reporting that it's not a puff piece. It's not a, this is the great thing happening. It's actually, does this work? What is the evidence? It doesn't have to be, like research necessarily, but what are the signs that it's working? What are the outcomes that we're seeing? And really delving into solutions. So that's an alternative to episodic reporting on gun violence that is more helpful, we believe.
Great. Well, thanks again to all of you. I've got so many follow-up questions, but I'm going to leave it for the Q&A in the audience. The next question is for everyone, for everyone on the panel. And, you've all at least foreshadowed or started to partially answer this question, but to fill it out a little bit more, given what we know about the current state of reporting, where do we go from here? What are some tangible next steps we can take all together to improve reporting practices, to promote those more accurate narratives and advance the most empathetic, ethical, and impactful journalism when addressing this critical topic?
I can start. I feel like it should be more newsroom liaisons in different cities and different states, because we are really making a difference. It's like it's like when I go to these survivors, I am more like a friend or like a mayor with these families and the newsroom. It's like we all connect at one time. And then we become friends. And it's like the whole world is at peace. The reporter get their stories, the survivor feel comfortable, and the survivor family feels comfortable. Oh, hey, if he could do it, oh, maybe I can do it. And what they always say, well, how do you become a newsroom liaison? You know what? Can I apply for that? Or do you have more of those? Because, and there's always a trickle down effect. Now they say, my cousin was affected by gun violence. My brother was affected. Oh, my next door neighbor, can you talk to them? And the newsroom is the same way. Oh, Channel 10, I have a friend in Channel 10. Can you talk to them? The Inquirer say, hey, I have another new reporter. Can you talk to them? I'm even going to like a more, I'm going to inside the newsroom. We're going to reporters on the scene to talk. And I'm like, well, this is a lot, but I feel like this is my purpose, like I said before, because I'm helping everybody out. And with me helping everybody out, this is like, I'm not saying curing my PTSD or my trauma, but it's helping my trauma out. I feel comfortable now talking to everybody. So I think it should be more newsroom liaisons in every city and every state. Newsrooms should hire newsroom liaison. That should be part of their HR requirements now.
I'm just going to jump in with a quick pitch, by the way. Thank you, Oronde. What we need are more Orondes, I think. But following up on what Oronde said, I'll share some links at the end. But if you find our center online, we're not hard to find. This is exactly what we do. So if you're working in a Philadelphia news organization, or maybe even if you're further away and want to have a talk, we can connect you with Oronde, and maybe someday we'll have more Orondes. That'll be hard to do, but thank you. And from Dr. Beard and Cheryl, from your perspectives, either one, when you want to sort of chime in on next steps from, in terms of your own work.
Sure, I can kick it off. So I am an instructor in a program called Transforming Crime Coverage to Public Safety coverage, which is based at the Poynter Institute. It focuses institute focused on training journalists. So I do want to say, like, I know we've talked a lot about doom and gloom, but the industry does know this is a problem. And a lot of journalists are interested in trying to figure out what the solution could look like, right? So that that course really focuses on a change management process, which starts with, what are we covering crime for in the first place, right? Like, what is the mission of public safety coverage? Because the way we've been doing it, the mission is not to serve people, really, right? Because this is not the best way to give people information. We're hearing both from lived experience and from research that the way that we're currently covering crime is not making our community safer. It is not reducing crime, obviously. So what are we doing? How can we do this differently? So starting with what is the mission, and then allowing that to dictate what stories are we going to cover? How are we going to cover them? What is the language that we are using, right? Because sometimes language choice, Jim is a photojournalist, so he knows photo choice, the choice of what we're showing on screen when we're talking about things. This makes an impact on whether people receive empathy from the viewer or the reader, whether people feel like this is a solution that is solvable. Because oftentimes we just kind of feel hopeless despair watching it, like, oh, what are we going to do? This is just how it is. And it doesn't have to be that way. And so that is kind of one approach that I think we've seen some success in that class, and we'll be doing some more of those classes over the next few years. But I think really getting back to what is the mission, who are the people we're trying to serve, and what do they need, is a really helpful place to start.
May I ask a quick follow-up, Cheryl? So I had the opportunity to audit that course, and you were brilliant. It was an outstanding course. And I learned practical things like how an idea becomes newsroom policy, but how newsroom policy, you have to take some more steps to put it into practice and so on. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm endorsing this course. And I attended the last round and I understand it's happening again. Do you know when or how people can register, or is it too early?
It's a little too early, but we will have more details on that soon. I would say be on the lookout January if you're interested. There should be some things popping up around that time.
That would be at pointer.org.
Yes, pointer.org, and look in their class section. It'll be there. You can look up crime and it'll come up.
Thank you. And in the event that that's new to anybody, that's POYNTER. Thank you. Dr. Beard, do you want to follow up?
Yes, thanks for those great suggestions, Cheryl and Oronde. And I mentioned before, I believe, sort of the outputs of the Better Gun Violence Reporting workshop that we had. So they were, generally centered around basically elevating the voice of the community and building connections and trust between journalists and community. And sort of the two kind of winning ways to do that were an actual space for journalists to interact with community members and training in trauma-informed journalism. And I would add to that, as Oronde mentioned, that I think would be helpful is training for folks who want to tell their stories in media literacy, because it can be really, even for me, overwhelming and intimidating to talk to a journalist. So those are things that we're actively working on and we're excited about that came out of that process. I wanted to bring up something else too that I think has the potential for great effect, and that's policy change and adding to journalistic guidelines. So we know we have an example from suicide and reporting on suicide and seeing changes in that coming out of guidelines and following guidelines, and even before that coming out of research. So just a few decades ago, suicides were covered sensationally. And that's really changed due to the recognition from research. There's hundreds of studies on this, identifying a connection between the incidence of suicide, the number of suicides, and harmful reporting. So one of our main research goals at the center is to actually develop consensus on what does harmful reporting around community firearm violence look like, to measure that, and then to test and see if it's associated, number one, with racial and geographic disparities in harmful reporting. We're starting in Philadelphia. And then also to examine really empirically with numbers, with research, the connection between harmful reporting and shootings, harmful reporting and gun violence on a national scale. And we believe that if those connections are there, that could really inform the development of guidelines that could be effective. So we're working on that. And of course, it's, we don't have to wait for the results of those to begin to talk about how we should be doing this better and to begin to work to create policy for better reporting on gun violence.
Great. Thanks again, Dr. Beard. In preparation for this call, just in case somebody asked, I looked up a bunch of those studies, and there's just an incredible abundance of research on violence and suicide in the media. But maybe a better advice I could offer, again, if anyone wants to go to our homepage in the suicide prevention section, which is near the bottom of the left column, there's a link to a course, another course that I took recently, Responsible Reporting on Suicide, organized by some folks at Johns Hopkins. It's available for free on Coursera, and there's a link on our homepage. It's led by Aneri Patani, who was actually a Philadelphia Inquirer reporter not so long ago, and it's another priceless resource. Okay, well, finally, moving toward the end here, not to cut anybody off, but find my place again. The last thing we're going to do, and you can take the time that it takes, but we're calling this a lightning round question. But what if you had a magic wand and you could walk into any newsroom, and this is a question for everybody on the panel, and if you could walk into any newsroom and immediately change one thing about their gun violence reporting, what kind of newsroom would you walk into? Would you walk into a newspaper, a legacy, multimedia newsroom, or a TV station, or a digital first organization, or community news? What kind of newsroom would you walk into? And what's the one thing you would change right away if you could?
I'll go first,
Thank you.
mostly just so nobody takes my answer. I got some other ones too, in case. So I would walk into a TV newsroom, and the reason why I would choose a TV newsroom is because I think that a lot of people are watching TV news. That's where a lot of people are getting their news. And I think that it percolates into social media, which is another thing that we haven't really talked about, but that there are spaces on social media that are causing a lot of trauma to survivors of firearm violence. That's why I would choose TV news. And the thing that I would change is I would change it to no more police sources, no police sources, no episodic crime reports, community sources.
I like that. I like that. I similarly would choose TV news because we know most people get their news via TV. Newspapers produce the most original content about a place, but TV is where most people get the information that comes from those newspapers. So I similarly would choose TV news. And I think there are so many things that I would want to change, but I would change the format of the newscast. So the way newscasts are currently structured, as you all know, is like 20 seconds here, 40 seconds there, and you're trying to get through the major news of the day very quickly and keep it moving. And that format creates the problem of episodic reporting, shooting the blood very quickly, shooting the street. And we don't have enough time to talk about, oh yeah, this community has been blighted by decades of neglect. Or, this victim, comes from this background, whatever the case may be, that gives more context and more humanization. So I would change the format to actually have longer segments, maybe fewer segments, but longer, focused on things that really impact communities and that can help communities.
It reminds me a little bit of going to the root cause, right? Go to the root cause. Thanks. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Oronde. You're next.
No. I should have went first. They was like all my answers. So I switched my answers up. I would too do TV news because everybody watched the TV news. That's like a confirmed way of knowing it's real because it's on TV. But I would change. I would make you have to be a survivor or life experience gun violence survivor, so you'll be the editor before the news come on. You don't have to be like an anchor, but the editor. So if they watch, if they about to put they notes out and whatever, and it's about to be on the news, but the survivor would read over the notes before it's about to be on TV and edit everything so they know what's going to be harmful or not.
Beautiful, thank you. That's brilliant. We're a few minutes ahead, so I've got one more sort of related question, or not the same sort of question, but from a different perspective.
Can I ask what Jim would do? Can you tell us? Are you prepared?
So far, which is still, thank you. But we're all kind of like-minded, but yeah, based on what we know so far, I would say it's time to stop episodic gun violence reporting. But much like the guidance from the Associated Press, for everybody's benefit, the Associated Press style book is the newsroom guidebook that lots of news organizations use. Larger ones like the New York Times have their own, the Inquirer may, but it's the standard for reporting. And their advice for coverage of suicide is to they say not to cover episodes of episodic gun violence. They say to report the issue, not the incidents. But they have room for exceptions. So that's a little difference between what you said and I'm thinking, Dr. Beard. They say, they might make exceptions for a public figure, although there's evidence that the coverage of celebrity suicides has led to contagion of suicide. They said that they say there may be exceptions. to the best of my recollection, for suicides that take place in landmark locations or that cause a significant disruption to public services. You have to, balance the other journalistic responsibilities. It's sort of like the code of ethics from the Society of Professional Journalists. They say to minimize harm, because you don't want to harm anyone at all, but sometimes to perform some other necessary reporting, there may be unintended consequences that may do some harm. So I'm not sure I'm a complete abolitionist, but I'm ready to turn it on its head and say, let's just stop it right now, but consider some exceptions. What did I say? I had one.
Sorry, I interrupted your follow-up question.
You got me all excited and I lost my place. So my last question, a sort of variation of that magic wand question. Let's say instead of a magic wand, what if you had the day off tomorrow? What if you didn't have to do anything for anybody else? Everyone here has another day job, right? If you didn't have to do anything for your day job and your family was off doing something else and you were on your own, and you really felt the urge to do something for whatever this is, our center, this issue, this cause, this approach of changing gun violence reporting, and seeing if it can reduce harm and possibly prevent violence. In other words, I'm asking, what should we really be working on if we could do one more thing?
I would if I had the day off, I would take like all the reporters out for dinner, because you never know what they go through. And when I talk to them, they were like, they're traumatized also, and they just thrown in the fire. They just got out of college and they're so excited to report everything, but they don't know, they don't understand how harmful it is. And they don't know what they're doing. They just feel like this is a good story. And they're like, well, I did a good job, boss. On to the next one. And I would like to take them out and just explain to them, maybe for an hour or two, what are they really doing? That's what I would do if I had the day off.
That's a tough one to follow. Anybody else?
Yeah, it is tough to follow. I mean, I think similarly, I'm much less of a social person than Oronde, but I would be looking to think about, like, how can we incentivize the behavior we want? Like, I think this is a systems issue where there are so many forces at play that keep this status quo in place. And I think to Oronde's point, a lot of journalists are like, oh, I'm causing harm. Oh, I don't want to cause harm. That's not what I'm trying to do. That's not why I got in this vocation. But there's so many forces at play that make it the default to continue to do reporting in this way. And so I just want to spend time thinking about, like, how can we incentivize thematic reporting as opposed to episodic reporting? When newsrooms are shrinking and they don't have enough reporters and things like that already, how do we incentivize those things? So that would be my day off.
If I may, I'm going to just jump in for a second. Nobody asked, but you really pressed a button for me. I agree with what you're saying, Cheryl, but there's something else I know from firsthand experience, that there are some intense and extensive perverse incentives for doing harmful work. As I've shared with all of you and many others in our network, I did a lot of this work. I did a lot of harmful reporting in the past, with the best of, like everyone now, with the best of intentions, working very hard, believing it was the best public service. But so while we could create incentives for better reporting, maybe we could also, I guess my idea in response is we could figure out how to de-incentivize harmful reporting. Dr. Beard, do you want to follow up on that? On anything you've heard so far?
It's hard to imagine a day off. Let's see. I will still be working. I was thinking writing a grant application. No. So, one of the things that I think is really important, obviously, that I've mentioned a couple of times, is sourcing, right? And one of the things that I personally struggle with a lot is how to be that best other source, the alternative source that's going to be, interesting and be able to sort of explain those root causes in a way that people understand and highlight effective solutions. So I think what I would work on is building and training an alternative source list, a source list that includes people like Oronde who are, ready and so able to tell their stories. And then people like me who, have some expertise in gun violence prevention, but really needs, all of us need, training and to know how to most effectively tell our stories. And then journalists need to have access to us in a way that makes it easy for them to have us as alternatives. So that's what I would work on.
Great, thank you. And I'm just so grateful to all of you for this conversation so far. But I think it's about to really pick up, because right about now, I think we're ready to toggle over to the audience Q&A. And I'm going to hand it back to Mark Hauk to read the questions. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Perfect. Thank you, Jim. So we have several questions from our audience today. I'm going to read them as word for word as possible, but we kind of get these throughout the event. So we may have some that we've already at least partially answered. There are also many comments. So as I go through them, let me know if you'd like to respond or move on to the next one. So I'm going to go through the questions first, as many of them as I can. First one, I think I can answer. We got many questions about how do I get a recording of this. There were also several other resources mentioned, a Coursera course, and I think, Cheryl, at the top of your remarks, you mentioned the Philadelphia Inquirer article. Stoneleigh will pull all those resources together after the event today, and we'll circulate a post-event email in the days to come. Next question comes from, just one moment. Let's see here. So the first question is from Bill Madway. Bill says, why are suburbanites fixated on stories about crime in urban areas? Is it to justify their decisions to flee cities for the suburbs?
I think it may be slightly the wrong question of saying why suburbanites are obsessed with urban crime coverage. What I will say is because suburbanites were the ideal customer for news and the ideal viewer, their communities got a much more holistic view as opposed to the urban communities that most notably got crime coverage. So as we saw the kind of action news or the eyewitness news model take off in the 70s and 80s, one of the things they recognized was, it's good, like on the weekends, to go to the suburban community events and cover them because people like that, right? And they'll watch the newscast in order to see what's happening. That wasn't happening in urban communities. And also, it's just much easier for most TV news, which is based in the city, to get to a crime scene somewhere in the city than to go an hour out up the main line or, out to South Jersey, whatever the case may be. So I'm unsure. I can't go so far as to say suburbanites like to see crime in urban areas. I wouldn't go that far. But the incentives for newsrooms end up with a picture that distorts reality to show a lot of crime in urban areas and a lot of positive news in suburban areas based on who they're trying to serve.
And I just wanted to highlight, what Cheryl said. This is what structural racism looks like, right? So that's fundamentally what we're talking about here, is we're talking about something that was invented as a business to get ratings that now is entrenched in newsroom culture, in training of journalists, and in the way that stories are told on TV news, that is causing racial harm and perpetuating racial stereotypes and perpetuating ineffective solutions to gun violence and hindering public health or more holistic prevention measures. So it's not really related to the question, but I wanted to kind of highlight how something that could have started a certain way based on, whatever, something as simple as a business model has now resulted in something that's so harmful.
Great, thank you. So our next question comes from Anonymous. Anonymous says, great panel. What can be done about the rise of action news social media accounts? There are many in Philly that often post surveillance videos of incidents. Some even have subscription arrangements to be able to obtain uncensored videos of violence. Do we need to start with traditional media before we can address these social media spaces?
I guess I could chime in with just a little basic information. First of all, when we were planning our recent Better Gun Violence Reporting workshop, we wondered, should we address, there's some incredibly prominent social media accounts. And like I was saying about newsrooms, I think a lot of the folks launching them, managing them and leading them believe that they're doing the best public service, but our research we're familiar with shows that it's often very harmful. And who are we to judge? But we try to bring together the knowledge and the people. We determined that it was just too much for the workshop we were planning, for the day we had, the agenda we had, and the people we had. But maybe it's something that we need to do in terms of, maybe that will be an upcoming event. If I had one more day, one more free day to do anything I wanted, I might start digging into what we can do to help address those questions. At the same time, I don't know much about where those surveillance videos are coming from. So if the person with the question has more information, we'd love to hear from them.
I feel like that maybe because one of the sites, it's like 3-4 sites that's on social media all the time, and they get the news before the news get the news. So I feel like maybe the newsroom should partner up with these people, because I see in the comments, you have reporters commenting on the social media posts. So maybe they should work together and collaborate, so they don't have to, so it don't be like a no gun zone media. It could be like from a real source. And these people should get like compensated, because everything is, when you pull up a camera and when they hit send, that's where everything happens at. And the reporters don't get that like everybody else get on social media.
I agree. I mean, I think that this is a really important facet to what we're talking about, and a place where, harmful things are happening for people who've experienced gun violence. When we interviewed our patients, we didn't actually define what media was. And so a lot of people talked about things that they'd seen on Instagram accounts. And specifically, there were videos of them, being just right after being shot, being placed in a police vehicle for transport to the hospital, that were really upsetting to see there. So I think the reason why we've sort of focused on, traditional media is that there are kind of ethical codes and principles that should be guiding the way reporting is happening. But I think social media is a very, very important focus that we need to work on as well.
I guess if I were to add just one more beat, another thing that those accounts do really well is maintain community conversations. And that's something that news organizations could learn from or access by partnering perhaps. So while there are aspects of some of those accounts that we're critical of, there are some undeniable benefits in the service they provide too.
Wonderful, thank you all. So next question comes from Wanda Campbell. Wanda says that she is associated with Temple University's Family Friends program and would like to know why we aren't recognizing that communities of color are being supplied with free guns for our children to murder one another. Wanda adds some additional context saying that historically drugs, guns, etc., are purposely placed in the Black and Brown community. If this is really going to be addressed, this is a real root cause.
Yeah, I agree, Wanda. I mean, and that's the challenge with the kind of episodic reporting that we keep going back to, is that it doesn't allow to talk about the deeper things like, where are all these guns coming from in the first place, right? Where are all of this, where are these things coming from? We don't have, people, coming and going from, moving across state lines, et cetera. And when you talk to community members, they bring up these topics. Like, these are things I actually want to know about. Like, where are the guns coming from? One of the challenges that we have as well in journalism that we're also trying to work through is that we often are not informed by community members on what they want to know. we set the news agenda because, you know, we have the eye test, we know what is newsworthy, and we just tell the story. And a lot of us, we're not living in the communities where these things are happening. So as a result, we're missing out on the fact that, like, there's a story here. Someone should do an investigative story on where are the guns coming from, right? Someone needs to figure that out. We're just like, oh, they got the gun, you know, it's just assumed that that's just a common practice and people aren't thinking deeper about it. So I think, you know, building those deeper connections, like one of the recommendations that came out of the workshop that was put together, I think will be a really important to actually getting to, these are the questions that actually need to be answered to make community safer, as opposed to, oh, a shooting happened here, oh, something happened there. So I think that's a really important point.
And I think related to that too, Cheryl, and to Wanda, thanks for making that point. You know, guns are a huge part of this discussion. We've kind of focused on sort of the violence side, but also there's a firearm or a gun involved as well. And, you know, one thing just that I wanted to kind of add to this discussion as a public health researcher is that, you know, our government essentially censored research and evaluation of policies that could prevent gun violence from 1996 until the mid 2010s. So you have to understand that we are working in a situation where there's very little, you know, funding to do academic research, but also very few people who are even trained and able to do this research that can tell us what policies work. That being said, we do know that there are policies that prevent gun violence that are enacted on a state-by-state level. And you're absolutely right, Cheryl. Those are the stories that people want to hear. And that's exactly sort of the harm of episodic crime reporting is that people think gun violence is inevitable. People think that it's not preventable. You know, that's the narrative and the worldview that gets reaffirmed by episodic crime reporting, when in fact it is preventable. It doesn't happen in other countries. And we know lots of different ways to prevent it, including policies.
And often, just to piggyback off that, people think the only way to prevent it is mass incarceration. So like we saw with the past election cycle, the real push of like you're soft on crime or hard on crime is like the dichotomy of dealing with crime just in one way, and reducing gun violence is just locking people up, which we know based on the research and evidence that's not the only solution, and it's probably not even the best solution in a lot of cases.
And that's exactly why the conversation around what the public narrative is on gun violence is so crucial right now. We do have a real increase and it's a real surge in gun violence in the country. Firearm-related injury is now the leading cause of death for children in our country. It surpassed motor vehicle crashes in 2020. It has been the leading cause of death for young Black men in our country for years. So it is a true emergency and we need to talk about it, but this style of reporting that doesn't delve deep into solutions, and specifically into solutions that will have public health impact that will prevent gun violence, has the danger of reaffirming things that will not work and reaffirming things that will be harmful. So that's kind of why now more than ever, this topic is so important.
Thank you both. So our next question sort of summarizes a similar question we've gotten from a lot of folks today. Emily Virgin writes, how can the public help demand better from the media? A few others have asked how advocates can get involved as well.
Well, that's it. I think we have a lot to say about that, right? So so for context, Jessica, I think you know more about this in detail, but this isn't a new idea, right? There have been studies on addressing gun violence as a public health issue in the media going back 30 years, and in a conference, even a conference from the 80s, and why it isn't happening has a lot is a big question in our work. Or in other words, how are we going to implement even our own new knowledge, coming from our research on this topic? And so we're just trying to begin to figure out. There was one organization that did some research in depth 20 years ago and went around and led newsroom workshops on the topic. And yet it's really, the scientific community isn't conflicted over this. It's the police and public officials and the media that don't quite get it, that it's not going to be solved by addressing it from a law enforcement or criminal justice perspective. That it's resolved. It's resolved, except where it's not.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a lot of media likes to frame things as a conflict, one party versus another, one idea versus another, right? So to Jim's point, although the consensus in the kind of scientific community that's studying this is everyone's on the same page, that's not the most interesting story. And unfortunately, part of that is that people like to watch conflict, right? Like conflict is the heart of any story, any book that you read, any movie, protagonist, antagonist. And so the default of a lot of newsrooms is to cover crime or cover gun violence in this way, in part because it is a lot of times what gets the most clicks and gets the most views and gets the most attention. And so I think audiences, we have to be more conscious of that and divert our attention from that and give attention to what we want to see more of, because that is how we change the incentives from our little neck of the woods.
Absolutely. And I mean, we welcome people to be involved in our organization, the Philadelphia Center for Gun Violence Reporting. We're kind of constantly looking to evolve and to enact those ideas from our workshop, which will certainly need community involvement. So.
All right, thank you all. Next question comes from Seth Kaplan. Seth says, how would solving more gun violence crimes, especially murders, help the survivors community?
So, you know,
Go ahead, Jim.
I really want to know your answer, Oronde. But first, I'd just like to frame it a little bit because I almost jumped in a couple of questions ago. Just to clarify, our work is focused primarily, almost entirely on the role of the media. So we're not specifically, you know, you can imagine that we spend a lot of time reading and learning about root causes and prevention, but that's not exactly our lane. More of what we do is convene events. It's kind of unusual for us to just get together like this and talk about ourselves. It's we generally bring, well, Jessica leads research that involves community representatives, but also we have events that bring people with extensive lived experience together with journalists with advanced professional experience. So that's the role that we play. So I don't mean to quash anybody else's opinion. I just want to be clear when I hear some of these questions, it's not exactly what we do. Having said that, I'd like to hear from anybody else who wants to respond. Rhonda?
Oh, no, with the other question, it's not so that it will help survivors per se, because our crime is already done. It's not like, oh, we're like feasting on the next crime, but we need to have more murders solved. I think that's the issue in Philadelphia. But we have so many murders, like we had like 4 the other day. So you can't expect every murder to be solved each day if we have more and more is compiling up. So as survivors, I do tell fatal survivors, like, listen, to family members, like, listen, I know your loved ones just got murdered, but the wait list is long. And I know they see on TV like the first 48, we're gonna get it solved, but you have 470 first 48s that was just this year. So it is a waiting game when it comes to solving murders.
All right, thank you all. So I have a handful of comments here from folks who've posted, especially ones highlighting a few resources. So I'm going to run through those quickly. If you have anything to say, by all means, please jump in and do so. So first one comes again from Seth, who says, it would interest Oronde and all participants to know that about a month ago, Boston's Channel 10 NBC, a reporter did a 3-minute segment on the survivors of gun violence. He emphasized the economic cost of supporting people who have been shot. Between saving a life, rehabilitating that person, and getting them back into life is about $30,000 a year. The reporter estimated that about $570 million a year are spent on these efforts. So next is Cynthia Simmons. Cynthia says that a book suggestion on sometimes unconscious racist stereotyping in the media and the harm that it does is, quote, the Black image in the white mind, unquote. And then last resource, let me see if I can find it here. Oh, this is again, Cynthia. She says on Thanksgiving, the New York Times had a story by Max Fisher and Josh Keller on a study that showed the prevalence of gun ownership. That was the only explanation of our high rates of mass shootings compared with other nations. So just wanted to run through those. Let's see, next question, if we have maybe just time for one or two more. Let's see here. So this next question comes from Steve Volk. I'd love to know what ideas you've developed on how to talk to reporters and the ways they can do a better job. It can be hard to tell someone who believes that they are already working for the greater good that they in fact aren't. So how do you talk to the media about it? Forgive me if this came up earlier.
Oh, that's a great question, because that's what my job is. All I do is tell them the truth. Like, listen, this is harmful. And if you don't think this is harmful, I will show you examples why this is harmful. I will put a 3-way call with a survivor. I will talk to a survivor family with the reporter and show them why this is harmful.
Yeah, and I think to Oronde's point, like, it's also good to remember that this is a larger system, right? Like, I think, you know, the $1 million question for all of us who work in this kind of training field is, how do we get people who feel like they're doing the right thing to see a new way of doing things? That's the $1 million question for all of us. And I think part of it is saying, you know, listen, this isn't a you problem. This is a media system problem. Even if you're trying to do the right thing, there are so many forces at play that make it hard. And so, like, let's talk about how you can do things that may make it better as an individual, but let's like scheme together on how we can really create a better system that makes it easier for you to do this work and better serves our community. So I think trying to take it away from personal blame to like, this is a problem we're all trying to solve together is most helpful there.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think adding, you know, tools like offering something too can be helpful as well, because I think a lot of journalists see things exactly like we've talked about in our conversation and want the tools to make things better. And it's often very hard to go up against a system. Like, I always use this example. Look, I'm a doctor. I know it's not easy to come to the hospital as a patient. And I know that our medical system has many broken things about it that I would like to change. So when, you know, people have their criticisms of a medical system or even of my hospital, I don't take that personally, because I know that doesn't necessarily reflect upon me as a human. So I think we all need to work together to kind of tear down some of those systems that are harming people.
And I'm going to steal an idea that I've heard both Jessica and Cheryl say this before, maybe everyone in our network, but you know, Philadelphia is the city of firsts, and you know, it was this is where you know, where it all began with Action News. The practice in TV newsrooms around the country came from here. So why can't we be the first city to change the practice, to move forward with you know, trauma informed, community informed best practices to stop the harm and maybe help stop the violence?
All right, I think we have time for one more question, then I'll turn it back over so we can close out the webinar. Final question is, how responsive do newsrooms seem to be to your gun violence reporting guidance? Are print or media outlet newsrooms more or less responsive compared to TV newsrooms?
Everyone's unmuted. Go ahead.
I think that the TV news is more responsive. When you email them, they get right back to you because they don't know they're doing harm. So when you email them, they get excited and say, "Oh, hey, thanks for emailing us." And when you talk to them, that's when they realize, like, okay, I'm doing this. And they definitely will schedule an appointment with you and everything, even when it's on Zoom. The printed ones, the only ones that I know is the Inquirer. Everybody else that they don't respond to me at all. So I don't know if they issue, but they don't respond at all.
Yeah, I mean, from our class, we have a mix. It does lean a little bit more toward TV, but it's a pretty even mix. I think TV leans into it a little bit more because print often covers more topics. Crime is a smaller amount of their total coverage than TV. But we see a pretty even mix. Some people went completely through the process and came up with their tactics and all of that. Some people fell off the bandwagon. I mean, that's change management, right? So that happens, but we had a good amount of people actually complete the process and are hoping to have more along the way.
And I'll just add to that, we've had interest in, the results of our research. We've presented it to TV news outlets. One thing that we haven't talked about is radio. I mean, there's some really innovative, exciting things happening at WHYY. They have 2 gun violence prevention reporters who are specifically on the prevention beat, if you will, for gun violence, which is phenomenal, and hopefully at least due in some part to some advocacy that we've been doing. So I think that there, obviously each type of media has its own limitations, and there may be more opportunities to tell in-depth stories in print media, and we have to sort of imagine what the in-depth story looks like on TV. So long story short, I think we've seen responsiveness everywhere to varying degrees and a lot of interest in these ideas.
All right, so with that, Jim, I'll turn it back over to you.
Sure, thanks. And I'm going to just chime in a little bit on that last question, and I'm going to boast, because when you ask how are they responding, well, that's a long conversation. I know time is short, but I'll tell you one way that they responded. At our Better Gun Violence Reporting workshop recently, we had Word Radio, WHYY Radio, KYW Radio. We had the Inquirer, all 4 TV stations, community media. There's somebody in every newsroom that really, and maybe lots of people, maybe most of the people, but there's somebody in every newsroom who cared enough to come and work with us. So I think the response is it's challenging sometimes, but it's pretty strong. Okay, thank you. So before you log off today, I just want to ask everybody to please follow us online. We're at pcgvr.org, not the catchiest acronym, but we're pretty easy to find overall, the Philadelphia Center for Gun Violence Reporting. If you find our homepage, look around, there's a lot to see and hear and read on our homepage. And there's a contact form if you'd like to get back to us. And we're pretty responsive across most key social media platforms. And as Jessica said, we're always looking to work with more new partners. I want to say thank you to our panel. Thank you to all of you who spent your afternoon with us. And thanks again, especially to the Stoneleigh Foundation for making today possible. Finally, I would like to welcome Stoneleigh Foundation's Executive Director, Ronnie Bloom, to make some closing remarks. Ronnie?
Thanks, Jim. It's great to see everybody here. As Jim said, I'm the Executive Director of the Stoneleigh Foundation, and on behalf of the staff and the Board of Directors, I'd like to thank this phenomenal lineup of panelists, Jessica, Cheryl, and Oronde, for participating in such a thought-provoking dialogue this afternoon. You've really given us very important insights into our media landscape and the ways in which it can be leveraged to change the narrative about the gun violence epidemic in Philadelphia by centering the root causes of the crisis and its solutions. We're truly honored to partner with each of you in this critical work, and we really appreciate the time that you've taken to share your experiences and your expertise with us. And thanks, of course, to our terrific moderator, Jim MacMillan. It's been such a pleasure to be able to get to know you and get to know the work of the center. What you're doing has a tremendous impact on our region, but also far beyond it as well. Today's webinar was the second in a series of events focused on addressing Philadelphia's gun violence epidemic. If you missed our first webinar, please visit our YouTube page to view a recording of last month's panel entitled Perspectives on Gun Violence, Schools, Police, Community, and Public Health. Lastly, in concert with this series, we're currently recruiting for our next cohort of Emerging Leader Fellowships. We're seeking applications from nonprofit, academic, and public sector organizations that are interested in hosting an Emerging Leader Fellowship focused very specifically on addressing gun violence from a policy, practice, research, advocacy, or communications lens. Applications are due by January 13th. So please visit our website and to learn more about it. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone in the audience for joining us today, and please stay tuned for more information about further events. Thank you, everybody.